Before we get into the main body of the talk, I want to give you a quick outline of how things are going to look tonight. First, we're going to actually define the problems that we're facing right now and the question that I'm asking. And then to answer that question, we'll go through three things. First, we need some scaffolding to answer this question. Then we're going to get some general principles from the early church about this question, whatever it is. And finally, we'll finish up by looking at some specific examples. Okay, so first, what are the problems that I'm thinking about, and what is the question that I am asking tonight? First, we get lonelier and lonelier as a society every single day. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General released a report studying the effects of loneliness on the United States population. And across every conceivable metric, loneliness is increasing. People feel more isolated, they're spending less time with friends and family, they report feeling companionship less, all of it is going down. Of course, a lot of this is from our old friend social media, the rise of technology that allows us to socialize with people without actually being physically in front of them is a huge part of this. And of course, our old friend COVID-19 didn't really help things on this front either. So that's like super big picture, Americans are getting lonelier every year. More specifically, I am a single man in the church, and I've thought about what does it mean to be a single person in the church for a long time. And I gave an entire talk on this last semester, so if you want all of the juicy details, go watch that on the YouTube. But to summarize, single people in the church right now are struggling to find meaning. We don't have a coherent story to tell about ourselves the way that married people do in the church. This is because we don't really have good theologies of marriage or of singleness. I talk about this in my talk, of course, but basically the picture that I paint is that to understand marriage, you need to understand singleness, and to understand singleness, you need to understand marriage. These are like two sides of the same coin. And because of this, our plight is ignored by many of our leaders because they don't have a good framework for understanding what single people can positively bring to the church. So, these two factors have led me to the following question. How can people have healthier, deeper, and longer-lasting relationships? Okay? We're struggling, we're getting lonelier. Single people in the church in particular are getting lonelier every year. How can we help people have healthier, deeper, and longer-lasting relationships? When I say relationships tonight, I don't mean romantic or sexual or marriage-like relationships. I just mean any relationship between two or more people that you might have, okay? So, that's the question. The next thing we need to do is we need to get some scaffolding. We need like a framework to talk about the sorts of relationships that people can have. To do this, we're going to turn to a man named Pavel Florensky. He does indeed have the nickname of the Russian Da Vinci. People call him that. He was a 20th century priest in Russia, an Orthodox priest. And if you go to his Wikipedia page, he has a truly ridiculous number of vocations on the first sentence. He was a theologian, a priest, as we already mentioned, but he was also a philosopher, a mathematician, a physicist, an electrical engineer, and an all-around polymath, okay? This is who your parents are comparing you to. We're going to be going through his book, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth. We're going to be only using one small section of it. It's a massive, complicated text. We're only using the section where he talks about human relationships in particular. If you aren't already familiar, in the ancient Greek language, there are 4 different words that describe different flavors of what we all lump together under the single word love. Many of you have probably heard of the C.S. Lewis book of the same name, The Four Loves. Florensky defines them as follows. First, there's herein, which is to direct a total feeling at an object, to surrender oneself to an object, and to feel and perceive for it. This is passionate, sensuous love, as the kiss of Gustav Klimt shows, right? In the ancient Greek, it doesn't have to be sexual, okay? That's one important difference here. When we think of eros, erotic things, that carries an inherently sexual, romantic tinge. In the Greek language, this is not necessarily the case. We'll see that a little bit more as we go on. Next is storgi. It's a calm and permanent feeling in the depths of the loving one. It It is the relation of kith and kin. So it's the type of love that you might experience for your uncles or your nephews or your kids or your grandkids, your family, but it's also the love that you might experience for your country, patriotism. These things are connected in the ancient Greek. Third is philein. These are all in the verb forms, by the way. If you are familiar with the Greek, the noun forms correspond in exactly the way that you would expect. Philein, philia is a noun form here. Florensky says it's an inner inclination toward a person induced by intimacy, closeness, and common feeling. It's a friendly relation, a tender expression of love. And finally, agapon, which he defines as rational love, which is based on evaluation of the loved one, and which is therefore not passionate, ardent, or tender love. Now, it's important to note here that he is giving all of these definitions for sort of the contemporary use outside of the New Testament. He's not necessarily talking about the New Testament here. And in fact, he says that when the New Testament writers start using these words, he says that the church use of philein came to signify Christian relations of love based on personal inclination and personal preference, while agapon expressed profound universal love, the love of higher spiritual freedom. So there's a shift when we go from general ancient Greek literature to the New Testament in particular that we need to be aware of. Of the four words up here, only two are ever used meaningfully in the New Testament, the last two, philein and agapon. Herein never shows up. It's not used in the New Testament a single time. And storgin appears twice, both times it's in its negative form, so the New Testament authors are speaking of something who is without affection in those cases. But if you go read the New Testament, they are only focusing on the last two, okay? In particular, Florensky says that the church switched focus on which loves they were focusing on. What do I mean exactly? Well, he says the following. A religious society is connected and held together by a double bond. The first part of this bond is personal connection, which goes from person to person, individual relationships here. The second part is the mutual perception of members in the light of the idea of the whole society. In this case, the object of love is not a single person taken by himself, but all of society projected on a person. For ancient society, these two bonds were eros, as the personal force, and storgi, as the principle of kith and kin. On the other hand, the natural soil for a Christian society as such became philia in the personal domain and agape in the social domain. It's important to note that in the ancient world, the difference between the ancient Roman secular pagan society and the world of the church was very pronounced. For the first 2 or 3 centuries, there was a very, very strong border between what the outside Romans were doing in the world and what the Christians were doing, right? The early church had to deal with 300 years of persecutions. They weren't exactly mixing with broader Roman society in the way that we might expect today. So what Florensky is saying here is as you cross that border, as you go from the secular pagan world of ancient Rome and you cross into the world of the church, we should expect personal relationships to be defined by philia and not eros, and we should expect communal relationships to be defined by agape and not storgi, okay? So there's some parallels here with our current situation today. There's one important difference, as I just mentioned. American society and the world of the church are much more porous, right? We're at Texas A&M. Breakaway happens every Tuesday at Reed Arena. There's a church event for Christians happening on a secular basketball arena every week. That's completely unthinkable for somebody living in the 2nd century because the Colosseum was used for killing Christians in the gladiatorial games, not going to church, right? So the mixing of American society and the world of the church that we experience right now is completely foreign to the world of the earliest Christians. I claim that our senses of eros and storgi have hypertrophied. We are very, very attuned and very, very capable of experiencing these two forms of love and thinking about relationships that are defined by them we understand what it means to fall in love with somebody romantically, or what it means to have a family. All of these concepts are very, very natural to us, right? As a consequence, our ability to sense agape and especially philia have atrophied. They've disappeared. I'm not going to be able to prove this directly tonight because doing a full comparison of how Americans relate to these four concepts compared to how the ancient people related to them would be a full PhD thesis, not something I can do in 60 minutes. But indirectly, what I hope you see as we walk through history is that these people that we're going to be hearing and learning from tonight have a very different understanding of what friendship can look like and of what church life should look like. And in particular, I'm going to be reading some quotes that speak of friendship and talk about friendship, and I want you to pay attention to how you react internally to those quotes. Because they make me uncomfortable sometimes, because they feel so strong and so overwhelmingly powerful, and they're talking about friends, which doesn't really make sense to us culturally, okay? So, that's the scaffolding. That's the framework through which we're going to talk about everything else tonight. Are there any questions quickly before we go on to general principles from the early church? Great. Okay, so to start with, we got to talk about the sibling ideal. For this part, I'm going to be following the work of Joseph Hellerman in his book, The Ancient Church as Family, and he says the following. He's talking here of how the early church's world organized the family, okay? So in our world, we organize the family in a particular way. We need to understand the way that people in Jesus' day and culture organize their families. And the term for how they organize their families is patrilineal kinship groups, which is a mouthful. But he says of these patrilineal kinship groups the following. At the very heart of the PKG ideal, patrilineal kinship group, is the sibling solidarity so characteristic of Mediterranean families. Indeed, sibling relationships reflect perhaps the most important distinction between ancient patrilineal kinship groups and modern Western kindred systems. And it is the patrilineal kinship group sibling relational model that the followers of Jesus appropriate in their image of the church as family. The emotional bonding we expect as a mark of a healthy husband and wife relationship is normally the mark of sibling relationships. So if you imagine for a moment that you are both married and have a sibling, right? Some of you in the room have both, some of us have neither, so it goes. But imagine that you have both right now. In our world, the relationship that symbolizes family is the marriage. When we think of family, the thing that defines the character of the family is the marriage, right? Two people get married, probably have kids. That's what we think of if I say the word family. That's what will pop into your head. What Hellerman is saying in that quote is that in Jesus' time and in Jesus' culture, that was not the case. It was instead the relationship that you had with your siblings that was defined as the closest possible relationship, the people that you relied on most with your emotional connection. In Jesus' day and age, you relied on your siblings, not your spouses. So if this is true, we should expect that to pop up in the way that Jesus talks about how his followers should behave, right? Well, luckily for us, we see exactly that. In Mark 10, Peter began to say to him, "See, we have left everything and followed you." And Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time." So he's talking about how should his believers, his followers, be acting. "Who will not receive 100-fold now in this time houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions and in the age to come eternal life," because that's how Jesus ends like every third sentence in the Gospels, right? So, I want you to notice in blue, which we're using tonight to represent storge and eros, the things that we understand, he is saying you are going to leave all of those. You are going to leave your father and your mother and your brothers and your sisters and your house and your lands. In exchange, you will receive, as part of joining the church family, all of those things, except he leaves out fathers, okay? And this is something that comes up several times. You see it most prominently in John 8 when he gets into this extended spat with the Pharisees about the Pharisees are claiming that they're all sons of Abraham, and it's this like really weird thing that we don't have any cultural sense for. Hellerman goes into great detail, and if you're interested in this stuff, I highly recommend his book, by the way. It's super readable. I'm a math major, not a history major, and that's his PhD thesis, and I found it super readable and super enjoyable to read. So go check that book out if this is interesting to you. He goes into great detail about what Jesus is doing in particular with this point. Another thing that Jesus said in Matthew 8 is we have this moment where somebody says, Jesus, I want to follow you, but I need to bury my father who just died first. And Jesus responds with, leave the dead to bury their own dead. If you were here for Joshua Malroy's talk a few weeks ago, you'll recall that burying the dead was of tantamount importance because burying the dead was how you gave them a chance at a good afterlife. So essentially, Jesus is saying to this guy, let your dad rot in hell. That's what he's saying there. That saying is so strong that Hellerman says it stands alone in the literature. You cannot find any other saying that is of comparable strength anywhere in the ancient Greco-Roman world. It doesn't exist. Jesus is saying something that's completely beyond the cultural understanding that they had at the time. That's how far he's asking his followers to go. We see Jesus talking about or showing that his followers are family in less obvious ways as well. We know from Josephus that the Passover was a family meal. And of course, Jesus ate the Passover with his disciples, right? The Last Supper. Okay, so Jesus conceived of his followers as a family. And of course, if Jesus conceived of it that way, then Paul probably did as well. And of course, that's exactly what we find. Paul uses the word brother and its cognates 126 times in the epistles. That's a lot, right? It's a lot of usage. Well, it's clearly something that he's returning to again and again. And in particular, Hellerman points out that he uses it the most precisely when the followers of Jesus that he's writing to are failing to live up to the ideal that siblings were expected to have in terms of how they related with one another. So for example, when the Corinthians are suing each other in 1 Corinthians 6, that passage where he is addressing the fact that they're suing each other, there's brotherhood language all over the place. We see this again in sort of the reverse situation when he comes to the Corinthians and says, hey, the believers in Jerusalem are poor, and they are sick, and they are needy, and they need resources. You have resources. In the ancient world, siblings were expected to share their material wealth with one another. So he is invoking this relationship of brotherhood that they all understood to be in common with all believers and saying, hey, you guys, comparatively, have way more resources than the believers in Jerusalem. Can you spare some of your own wealth so that I can take it and help those who are still in Israel? We see it again when he's asking Philemon to receive Onesimus as a brother, no less. If you aren't familiar, Onesimus was a runaway slave. Philemon was his master, and Paul is writing to Philemon saying, hey, I know Onesimus ran away. Please accept him back and not only not punish him, but receive him as a brother. Receive him in the closest possible way that somebody could receive him at the time. And finally, we see it when Paul is speaking affectionately of the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 2 and 3. So all of this to say, if you had to sum up the entire Pauline corpus in 2 words, it would be act brotherly. This continues through the early church period. I have a couple quotes from the early church. First, from Justin Martyr, who says, "We, who valued above all things the acquisition of wealth and possessions, now bring what we have into a common stock." So there's this trope again. Siblings share their material wealth with their siblings. "We, who hated and destroyed one another, and on account of their different manners, would not live with men of a different tribe, now, since the coming of Christ, live familiarly with them and pray for our enemies." He's saying, okay, before we were a super secular, insular people, and now we embrace all who are fellow believers, regardless of their cultural background or where they come from. Tertullian, who's a bit later, says much the same thing, and immediately preceding the quote that I'm about to give, he's talking about siblings who are siblings according to the common manner by having the same parents, right? He says, "At the same time, how much more fittingly they are called and counted brothers, who have been led to the knowledge of God as their common Father." That goes back to Jesus saying, only God is our Father, everybody else is our siblings, right? He goes on, "One in mind and soul, we do not hesitate to share our earthly goods with one another. All things are in common among us, but our wives." So, of course, at this point, we as Aggies may rejoice that even in the early church, it was recognized that Alabama is bad. More seriously, it is important to note here that although there was this rhetoric and understanding that the church functioned as a family or is supposed to function like a family, it doesn't mean that you can just have sex with whoever you want. It's important to note this because several recent theologians of our time have used exactly these facts that we're talking about tonight as justification for the sexual abuse of women. So, most famous example of this would be John Howard Yoder, for example. He used exactly these facts as justification for his sexual abuse of women for decades during his career. And then finally, there's Cyprian of Carthage, who was a bishop in the 3rd century, and I don't have any particular quotes from him to read, but we have a bunch of his letters that you can go read translations of online for free. They tell us a whole bunch of fascinating things about how the early Christians dealt with persecutions. My favorite example from this is he had to go in exile, as he was the bishop of Carthage, which is a very wealthy city, so he was a bishop of a wealthy congregation. He goes into exile during one of the persecutions, and he's having to write back to his congregation in Carthage. And he says, "Okay, guys, I know you love the Christians who are in prison. You're going to the prison too much. It is causing logistical problems for the people who are running the prison. You are actually harming our goals because you are so enthusiastic about going and caring for the people who are in prison." 200 years removed from Jesus, and the Christians are that enthusiastic about going and seeing their brethren who are in prison. Okay? So, that's the brotherhood side. And in general, brotherhood is going to be more towards the agape end of the spectrum. Of course, all 4 of the words for love that we talked about are not mutually exclusive, right? They're all talking about what we call love, so they're related to some extent. They're less, they're not so much mutually exclusive categories as emphasizing different flavors or experiences within the thing that we in English all call love, okay? So, we're going to turn briefly to look at friendship in the Bible and in the early church. It's most prominent in the Gospel of John. We see John laying on Jesus' chest in John 13. Some other points. Both agape and philia are used to describe Jesus' love for the beloved disciple, which is totally not John. It's definitely John. So this is interesting. They're sort of interchangeable. We see both of them used to talk about these loving relationships that Jesus seemed to have for particular people. But it's not always interchangeable. There are other situations where, especially when Jesus is talking about God's love for humanity collectively, we only ever see agape. We don't see philia. Okay? And there's this verse that many of you have probably heard before. Greater love, agape, has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends, philos. So he's putting agape and philia right next to each other. In fact, he's saying that if you want to fully instantiate God's love that he has corporately for humanity, you can't do that without specific, particular relationships, i.e., friends. So these are playing a sort of dual role to each other. Florensky has a lot to say about this that I wish we could get to, but we don't have time. Everybody should go read that book. It's awesome. But to sum up what Florensky says about this, agape and philia are dual in the same way that marriage and singleness are dual, if you were here for my talk last semester. They're playing a very similar role of trying to get at the same picture from like opposite perspectives. Later on, when we get to these three guys, John Chrysostom, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Basil the Great, all three of these guys wrote quite a bit about friendship. We're only going to hear quotes from two of them tonight. Chrysostom, what we're pulling from is from his second homily on 1 Thessalonians. Again, if you're interested in this, you should go read the whole thing because it's awesome. Chrysostom means golden mouth. He was so good at speaking and writing that the people of his time gave him this nickname. So it's pretty good stuff. He's pretty good at this writing thing. But just to pull some things at random almost, he says, friendship is a union of soul that affords unspeakable pleasure. He says that friendship is defined by continual close contact. He says explicitly that even daily contact with your friend does not satiate the desire to see your friend. That's a lot, right? Not even daily is enough? Okay, interesting. And then he notes that friends are able to both ask and receive favors, which may not seem like a big deal to us, but in an honor-shame culture, willingly like admitting to weakness in this way is a much bigger deal for them than it was for us. So there's a real letting of the guard down because he is saying this, okay? And then Gregory, the second of the three, he and Basil were lifelong friends. As we'll see in the quote, they spent a lot of time living together in actually the same house. Basil died before Gregory, and so Gregory had the pleasure or displeasure or both of having to give the funeral oration for his lifelong best friend, Basil. Gregory says, "And when as time went on, we acknowledged our mutual affection and that philosophy was our aim, we were all in all to one another, housemates, messmates, intimates, with one object in life, or an affection for each other ever growing warmer and stronger. This is the law of our superhuman love." And the word for love there is erotos, eron, which we think of as reserved for romance, right? We think of this as something that only married people can experience in a Christian context. But here's Gregory writing in the late 4th or maybe early 5th century, I forget exactly when Basil died, talking about a friend this way. That's a bit weird for us, right? That's not something that we are comfortable with. All in all to one another, that's something that you would say about your spouse, maybe, but you probably wouldn't say you were all in all to a friend, especially if you are married. I think that is important to note. We don't have a way of experiencing philia, and I do think what he is describing here overall is philia, even though he uses erotos here, because of course Basil was his friend. That's the category they would have used to describe this, okay? And I believe throughout this oration, which is quite long, he uses philia in other places to describe his relationship with Basil. Okay, so to summarize where we're at, there are some agapic principles. These are the general guidelines for how the church should behave corporately with itself. And I'm going to have 2 points for each of these. First, charity. So there's an indiscriminate sharing of our goods with those who need them. especially, oh, that's not good. Okay, I'll just keep going, and we'll hope that the slides come back by the time the next slide needs to come up. Oh, that's good. Look at that. Okay, so first we saw this principle of charity happening, right? The early believers are constantly sharing goods with one another, with all who need them. And they are really treating each other as though they were family. So there's a replacement in the early church of blood family, storge, with church family, agape. Okay? This was particularly important back then because often deciding to become a Christian meant leaving your family. They would kick you out. They would disown you. So when Jesus says you're going to have to leave your family, like that was a reality back then. So it was particularly important for the church to function that way, not only because Jesus called them to do it, but also because people really did just lose their families sometimes. So that's corporately, generally, how should we relate to one another. And then on the particular side, on the philic side, what does it look like? Well, we see with Jesus and John, and then John Chrysostom and Gregory. Gregory says they were housemates, messmates, intimates. They spent a lot of time together, right? Building a true friendship requires a consistent commitment to spending time in the presence of a friend. And I say Jesus and John because, of course, John spent 3 years living with Jesus as a disciple. Every day, talking with Jesus, walking with Jesus, eating with Jesus, learning from Jesus. That's a lot of time. You're going to build friendship that way. And then to emphasize how highly they valued friendship, it was a great comfort for them, right? It was a source of joy. And if you go look at how they talk about friendship, the phrase like unity of souls is going to come up continually. That's not just a one-off thing in Chrysostom. That's all over the place. And if you recall the John 15 verse, agape and philia are sort of playing this dual role, we see that these 2 points sort of correspond to each other. We're supposed to act with charity towards all, and then we are sharing our time, our precious time, the only thing that we cannot get back, right, with our friends. And then in the same way that family in those days, your sibling relationships were expected to be your comfort, these particular friends, like John Chrysostom's talking about, like Gregory with Basil, were a great comfort for them. Okay? Are there any questions before we go on to specific examples of these sorts of relationships? Okay. So, it's all well and good to have these principles, but these are kind of vague, right? There's not necessarily any particular thing that I can say, go and, like, live your life this way beyond, like, share your things with people. Like, okay, great, but how do I do that? How do I do that in particular? So, we're going to go through some of the ways that the church created relationships to express these understandings that they had of how people are supposed to relate to each other. So first, we're going to look at God-parenthood. And culturally, we still have an awareness, at least a little bit, of what God-parenthood is supposed to look like, right? We have some, like, vague notion of somebody who's supposed to, like, maybe bring you small gifts on your birthday and possibly, like, maybe be some sort of spiritual director, but not really. They're just sort of like a warm presence that's at the outskirts of your life. In the medieval church, this was not even remotely close to the picture. So, if we have this diagram here, you've got the parents, and then their child, the child of the parents is going to become the godchild to the godparents, who I've labeled as compatres and comatres. That's the Latin terms for these relationships that they had. And they literally mean co-father and co-mother. Okay? So that should already give you a sense of how seriously they took these relationships, if the godparents were actually becoming co-parents. You're becoming a co-parent with these other natural parents. So when somebody became godparents to a child, we have all of these new bonds that are formed. We have the relationship between the natural parents and the spiritual parents. We have the relationship between the actual godchild and his godparents. And then there's even a bit of a relationship historically between the godchild and the child of the spiritual parents. So first, we're going to look at what the actual godparent relationship looked like historically. And Joseph Lynch, who wrote this book, Godparents and Kinship in Early Medieval Europe, summarizes it this way. The godparenthood created by baptismal sponsorship flourished in Frankish society, so medieval France. Each child had one same-sex sponsor, and every responsible adult in the community was a godparent, perhaps even several times. The bond between adult and child was expected to be warm and nurturing, reinforced periodically by small gifts, favors, and acts of affection. The godparent also had religious and moral duties toward the growing child, in particular, the obligation to teach the Creed and the Lord's Prayer and to give moral guidance. So, they actively participated in the spiritual upbringing of their godchildren, and as a consequence, they were often lifelong affectionate friends and companions of the child. Now, when we hear actively participated in the spiritual upbringing, we think of one thing. And it's not necessarily, like we talked about, it's not necessarily something that like, oh, you're around your godparents all the time, right? That's not what we think of culturally when we hear about godparents. In the medieval world, because everything was so much more localized, godparents were probably around their godchildren every day. It was often the case that godparents had the ability to discipline their godchildren on their own, because again, it's a co-parent relationship too, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second, but the expectation was like, these people are really becoming fully parents, spiritually, of this child. Once you get to the later part of the medieval period, around the 12th century, it's actually the godparents who choose the name for the child in Western Europe. The parents do not name their own children. It's the godparents who get to name the child. So that should give you a sense of how seriously this relationship was taken in this day. If parents are allowing these godparents to choose the names for their own children, and unsurprisingly, the godparents often chose to name their godchildren after themselves, because what else are you going to do? Okay? So, it's easy for us, like with so many of the relationships that we're talking about tonight, like I say godparents and we have a cultural image of what that looks like, and it's not even remotely close to what it looked like historically. Okay? So that's the one that we do have context for, but what about this relationship between the parents and the natural parents and the spiritual parents? Well, it was called co-parenthood, in the Latin, cum mater and cum pater, but the linguistically astute among you may have realized that the Spanish word compadre comes from this. The Spanish compadre is co-father, and that's a direct descendant of those terms. We don't have co-parenthood because we live in the English-speaking Protestant world. But if you go to Latin America, the Philippines, basically anywhere where the lasting colonial influence was still Catholic, co-parenthood is actually the relationship that they emphasize when godparenthood happens. Lynch notes at some point that the co-parenthood is so important in so a lot of studies have been done on how these co-parent relationships look in like small Latin American communities. And it's been a consistent theme in these studies that the villagers desire co-parent relationships so strongly that if there isn't a unbaptized child available to form the relationship, they will sponsor just any random object and be like, okay, this is the child that is now forming the basis for this co-parenting relationship, okay? Which is interesting and fascinating and completely weird and strange to us, right? But all of that is flowing from this relationship that we had in the Western medieval world. As you might expect for people becoming co-parents, it was expected to be a relationship of equality. It was a relationship between equals, even if socially you weren't actually equals. So one way that this showed up is when you addressed your co-parent, you were expected to use that title in place of any other titles that might be floating around. So for example, Pope Hadrian I became Charlemagne's son's godfather, okay? He sponsored Charlemagne's son at baptism, became his godfather. Charlemagne and the Pope are now co-parents, which means Charlemagne and the Pope addressed each other as co-father, which was just a little bit of a diplomacy boost for Charlemagne because he didn't have to address the Pope as father like everybody else did. They were in this relationship between equals, and so he had a little bit more purchase with the Pope on what things he could ask for reasonably because they are now equals according to the Spirit. So if we characterize this relationship negatively on the ground day to day, of course, natural parents, spiritual parents should be free of strife, greed, and lust. And if we characterize it positively, they should be respectful, loving, affectionate, generous, so on and so forth. All the sorts of things that you might expect. But again, if you're living in Western medieval Europe, these are probably people that you are living around, working around, and seeing every day. You're getting really, really close with these people. So, this God-parenting complex, I think, would be the easiest relationship for us to just pick up and drop into our society. Because we do still have a residual framework for creating these relationships, especially in the Catholic world, right? We still have baptismal sponsors and we still have godparents happening whenever a child is baptized in the Catholic Church. So, this would be something that you, if you are going to have kids, you could very easily do and say, hey, I'm serious about this godparenting thing. Do you want to, asking somebody, do you want to become the godparents of my child? Obviously, there would need to be a discussion about expectations because we can't assume that people are going to think of this when we say godparenting. But this is a really, comparatively, this is an easy way of creating this expanded network of relationships that we have in the world. Okay, so that's the biggest one. And I want to glance over a couple others, and then we will wrap up and open for questions. So in the East, they had godparenthood, of course. Christianity is all developing at once. There are some regional differences between Eastern godparenthood and Western godparenthood. But in the East, they also had this relationship of brother-making. So here, we're following the work of Claudia Rapp, who's a scholar of the Byzantine period. And the ritual, adelphopoiesis, is literally brother-making, was characterized by a sharing of spiritual and material wealth. There was often an emphasis on spiritual wealth, so when this relationship was developing, she argues that it developed out of the development of the monastery. And in the monastery, there would often be these relationships of paired monks, whether it was two equals who came into the monastery as friends, got tonsured together, all of the things. They would get essentially go into the monastery as a pair, or you would have these like elder-disciple relationships that also functioned as pairs. And so there was a focus on a sharing of spiritual wealth So there's a lot of stories from this period about people entering into this brother-making relationship essentially because they want the benefit of somebody else's prayer. There's a whole bunch of stories of, oh, the emperor is dying, and so he, like, sort of coerces the patriarch into becoming his brother so that the emperor can be like, hey, pray for me to get better, please. And then, because the patriarch is a godly man, God just does it, and that's, like, the end of the story. It's a bit weird, but we can learn from that there was a focus on the spiritual wealth, the sharing of spiritual wealth especially. Again, it functioned to cross social boundaries, so if you were living in a period or a place where there was a lot of political conflict, you could become brothers with somebody on the opposite side to help settle down things. It was used to cross religious boundaries, so once you get towards the end of the medieval period, you have a lot of communities that are mixing between Catholic and Orthodox, especially in, like, Greece and southern Italy. And so they would use this relationship of brother-making to sort of cross the divide between Catholics and Orthodox. We know this because the Orthodox several times tried to tell them not to do that. They wouldn't write down a prohibition unless it was something that was happening constantly that they wanted to stop. And then again, on the personal, day-to-day level, how did it look? It was affectionate and friendly, one soul and two bodies, again, the same idea popping up. And it was often a solidification of existing friendships. And like godparenthood, it's irrevocable in character. So if you become somebody's godparent, you cannot unbecome their godparent. That's not how that works. In the same way, this relationship of brother-making was irrevocable. Once you became somebody's spiritual brother, you will unable to unbecome their spiritual brother. Okay, so finally, we're going to take a brief look at Florensky's view of friendship from all the way back at the beginning. So, the chapter on friendship in this book is sort of, it's recognized by people who have studied this book more than me that friendship is like the pinnacle, both of the book structurally, and it's the pinnacle of his theological outworkings that he's doing. And he says that true friendship is a combination of eros, philia, and agape. So we're mixing these three things. In practice, it is defined by a mystical unity, which makes even the everyday golden. And already that language sounds to us like something that we would say very readily of a romantic partner, but not very much a friend. He goes so far as to say that love is a metaphysical union of persons, and that friendship is the place where we see this the most, which is interesting. Because it's a metaphysical union, it's unconditional and limitless, because if my soul is truly becoming united with somebody else's soul, there can't be any conditions on which that is built, right? It doesn't make any sense to say that my personhood, myself, is intertwining with somebody else's self, but only conditionally. But only if, like, that doesn't make sense, right? And he goes so far as to say it necessitates concrete physical expressions of this, so we should use our bodies to express this union, including kissing. Okay? There's a lot of confusion here, which is understandable. But I want to point out two things. First, 5 different epistles end with the command to greet one another with the kiss of love, or some variation therein. So, already, this is uncomfortable to us, but it is in the Bible, and it is in the Bible 5 different times. So, while of course we need to be, like, comfortable with the fact that culturally there's a difference here, we are culturally different than the people 2,000 years ago, that's what the whole talk is about, right? There's still something clearly important that goes beyond just, oh, you're supposed to, like, greet one another affectionately. There's something deeper happening here. And the other reason he says this is actually linguistic. And it's that if you go to the passages where Judas betrays Jesus, The word that is used to say Judas kissed Jesus is philia. To be somebody's friend and to kiss somebody were the same word in the ancient Greek language. We don't have a framework for that. We don't have any cultural, collective imagination for understanding how being somebody's friend and kissing somebody were, close enough that they could be the same word. But if you go and look at what word is being translated, Judas kissed Jesus, it's philia, phileo. That's the word that's getting translated to kiss. Okay, so in conclusion, if we go back to our question, how can people have healthier, deeper, longer-lasting relationships? Well, it's by recognizing that God's covenant work through Jesus has made us all into one family. That's the principle of agape. We need to commit to sharing our daily lives with others. We need to get off the damn phones, right? Causing too many problems. And we need to create relationships, and as the church did, like godparenthood, which will help us extend our networks of support. So again, we're trying to combat loneliness. We need to expand the network of people that we are comfortable sharing our lives with and talking about how our lives are actually going. A word of caution before we open for questions. This is hard. That's why it doesn't happen very much, right? We don't do these things because it's hard. It's scary to open up to people. But it is good, and it is rewarding. So, if we focus on these things, I do believe we are capable of making headway and helping people have healthier, deeper, and longer-lasting relationships. Are there any questions? Comments, concerns, thoughts? Yes.
I have a question. So, in today's society, we're a lot less gender segregated than they maybe would have been
Mm-hmm.
in the ancient society.
For
So,
sure.
translating these relationships, do you think we should just, would you say that this should be picked up and kept, these type of relationships, as just like girls and guys, or would you say that with today's society being more open to friend groups that are of multiple genders that we should maybe intermingle it?
On an individual case-by-case basis, I don't see anything wrong with friendships between men and women. I think this is actually part of our problem, is that we pretend that every relationship between a man and a woman has a danger of becoming sexual, and if that's really the case, then we need to do something about that, because that's not how that is supposed to work, right? It is also the case that even in an ideal world, whatever that means, I would expect a lot more people to enter into these more friendship type relationships with people of the same sex. Just sort of naturally, there's a more shared experience there. But in principle, I don't see anything wrong with a man and a woman deciding to become brother and sister in the church world. Any other questions? Landry.
So you mentioned kind of at the beginning some cultural problems that kind of interfere with this, social media.
Yes.
I was thinking of another one is people are expected to kind of move and go to different places and live in different areas a lot more than they used to.
1,000%.
What do we do about that?
So that's part of commitment to some extent, is being willing to say, okay, if I'm going to become somebody's godparent, then I am committing to being around that child consistently for much of their upbringing, right? And we do have to reconcile with the fact that we live in a world where people are going to move for jobs. But I do think it is absolutely reasonable to say, okay, do you really want to take that job to move all the way across the country for a $5,000 raise, right? Is that really worth leaving this whole framework and leaving this community that you have built and leaving those relationships for an extra $5,000 a year, that's a sacrifice we should be willing to make, I think. And so just being willing to treat these relationships as though they are worth something, right? As though they are worth more than $5,000 a year, even if it means moving across the country. So does that sort of answer the question? Yeah. Okay, Sam, I saw you had a question.
I have a note of skepticism, which
Okay.
maybe it just needs to be like modulated.
Sure.
I feel like if people did the same sociological analysis
Mm-hmm.
to our society, they would say people in the modern Western world had extremely heightened relationships with their pets. They and then they'll point to like key examples where people have like dozens of pets. People will like take out certificates to make sure like
Mm-hmm.
their pets have the same last name as them.
Sure.
Um, continuously increased spending. Pets are kind of like a fairly core rite of passage for like raising children is make sure they have pets
Mm-hmm.
to grow up with. And then of course sociologists who don't necessarily have all the data and some people would even dress up as pets. So it feels like
Okay, great.
It feels like this sociological analysis could throw a lot of things in there, including some weird things like edge cases,
Mm-hmm.
which either one we should adopt the analysis with caution, or two we just need to say, are there any like first principles we can say like, okay, just because they did things like this back then doesn't mean we have to do it the same way nowadays.
Yeah, so when I say drop in, I don't mean literally take all of the cultural assumptions and just like shove them into society. I was speaking a bit loosely there, and that's on me. We do have to like figure out how to take the good things, and I do think there are a lot of good things that we can learn from this, and tool them to our own society. So like godparenthood. I don't think there's that much that we would need to change from how they thought about it to how we can think about it. In terms of like what are the principles that govern this relationship? And to respond to sort of the first part of that, of course, I am talking about like the best that the church had to offer, right? We're not talking about all the ways that this could fail. Of course it could fail. That's what Paul's letters are about, right? He was yelling at the Corinthians because they're suing each other 20 years after Jesus goes back to heaven. Like, that's a problem. There's always going to be problems.
And heightened relationships mean heightened vulnerability.
Yeah, of course, exactly. There's a million C.S. Lewis quotes that I'm going to all jumble into one here and mangle all of them in the process, but, the easiest way to keep yourself safe is to not love a single thing, right? If you don't love anything, there's no risk involved. So, any other questions? Yes.
I was wondering about, so like we as a church have a like marriage with a life
Mm-hmm.
story. I don't know if it's a very popular Protestant approach, but I know that like we kind of view marriage as like a symbolic, I guess, I don't know how to describe it, but basically the church is the bride, like, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I guess I'm wondering how that like really, because like what's the context of that when we have, because like you were saying that like the the bond between friends were more important than the bond between a husband and a wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess like for me it's taken it out of the context of like that being the most important thing. Because like in my mind it's always been like the bride is to the husband the most like important person in their life.
So, if you want the full argument, I would say go read Dr. Hellerman's book. And if you are still unsatisfied, you can go read the sources that he's summarizing. But I am firmly convinced that the spousal relationship 2,000 years ago was not the most important relationship. And he even gives sources from like contemporary cultures that basically descend from the ancient Near Eastern culture, where like a girl gets married to a guy and her siblings are still close enough that she can go visit them every day, and she does, because those relationships are more important to her. Regarding this point that Paul is making in Ephesians 5 about marriage referring to Christ and the church, yes, that is absolutely something that the early church needed to wrestle with. And if you hang around me for any period of time, you'll learn that like the early church is awesome, and also they did not understand what sex and marriage were about. It has taken 2,000 years for the church to start to approach a healthy understanding of the marriage relationship. Okay? It took a long, long, long time for us to get to a point where we really fully let the weight of that picture that he gives in Ephesians 5, like the full credit that it deserves for understanding what marriage is like.
I think we need to
Yeah.